I don't think many people play parlor games anymore. It's been a long-standing tradition in my mother's family, but no one else seems to know about the games. Still, I rather enjoy them. They're fun. After my father died, when I was still a young child, I found myself spending a lot of time with my mother's side of the family. She still held down a full-time job, and it was easier to let my grandparents and occasionally aunts and uncles babysit me than pay for a nanny or daycare. Even as a kid, I could sense that my mother wasn't happy with this arrangement. She didn't seem to get along with most of her family. Maybe that's why I was so tense the first few times she left me at my grandparents' house. As a way of easing my nerves, they introduced me to the parlor games, and I was hooked. Parlor games are games that are played indoors, often involving some type of riddles or wordplay. I love their cryptic nature, and it didn't take long for me to figure out the classics. My favorite was the Queen. My grandmother would sit in her armchair as though it was a throne, and my cousins and I would take turns kneeling before her. She would say to us, each in turn, "I am the Queen, the most beautiful queen in all the land. You must answer honestly. Who do you love?" I was the first of us grandchildren to figure out that the answer was honestly. My grandparents were a wealth of such games. We played the Queen, I'm Going on a Sailboat, and Rin Tin Tin. We'd play for hours on end, lost in their magic secrecy. My mother would smile a little when I told her about the games. She herself had played them as a child, as had my aunts and uncles. But there was one game that I wasn't allowed to play, a game whose name wasn't to be mentioned in my mother's presence. Black magic. I learned about it by eavesdropping. Even as a child, I was good at that, and often heard my aunts and uncles discussing it. Whenever it was brought up, they reminisced about how fun it was, how much they had once enjoyed playing it. Once, but not anymore. I wondered why, but I learned quickly not to ask. I only brought it up to my mother once, and that was enough to see the fire flare up in her eyes as she hissed, "Never, ever speak that name to me again." So, wisely, I didn't. No, I left the subject very much alone, until just a few weeks ago. It started because my grandfather passed away. Grandma had already died a few years before, and his death was not unexpected, so his passing left us not only with sadness, but also a touch of relief that his pain was over and that their legacy had ended, surrounded by the love of their children and grandchildren, just a few years apart. The aunts and uncles had gone out to discuss something about the burial, dragging my mother with them, who put up a very good pretense of not loathing all of them, much to my amazement, and all of us grandchildren had gathered in the living room to sit and remember. It was Andrew who brought up the parlor games. "Do you guys remember when we used to play those?" he asked, laughing as some of my cousins groaned. "How could we forget, not when Katie was so good at them? It almost wasn't fun with her winning all the time," Darius said, and I shot him a glare. Hey, I couldn't help it that he was a sore loser. "Well, there's one game that she never won though," said Andrew, giving me a sly sort of look. "What are you guys talking about?" I asked, annoyed to be out of the loop. The whisper came from somewhere across the room. I'm still not sure who said it. Black magic. My eyes widened and a rush of emotions hit me like a tidal wave. The nostalgia of the games, the curiosity over the one that sent my mother into a fury, the sudden burning need to know what it was. Oh yes, we were going to play black magic. We arranged ourselves in a circle on the living room floor, with Andrew acting as the caller, which is what we called the person in charge of directing the game. He instructed us to hold hands, and my cousins all grasped each other eagerly, watching me for my reaction. After all, I was the only one who'd never played. Okay, since it's Katie's first time, she gets to choose, said Andrew. Choose what? I asked. He smiled and shook his head. Choose somebody you don't like. I was bewildered as I sat there, trying to think of someone we all knew. Ann Coulter? Andrew shook his head impatiently as some of my more conservative cousins glared at me. No, not a celebrity, someone you know personally. I racked my brains again until I finally came up with a work colleague that I didn't particularly enjoy interacting with, mostly because he was a sexist dirtbag. Kyle Gantry. Andrew nodded. Okay, repeat after me, he started. It's in the moon, it's in the stars, it's black magic. My cousins and I all chanted together. It's in the moon, it's in the stars, it's black magic. The overhead light flickered a little, but I was the only one to notice because everyone else had closed their eyes. My gaze drifted to the ceiling, and I felt Amalia, who was holding my right hand, squeeze my hand reassuringly. It's in the breeze, it's in the air, it's black magic. And we repeated, it's in the breeze, it's in the air, it's black magic. The flickering was getting worse. I heard the TV turning on and off by itself. It seemed as though power was surging and ebbing through all the electronics in the house. I tried to pull my hands away, but my cousins grasped me tighter. Andrew began one last time. It's in the flesh, it's in the blood, it's black magic. I didn't want to join in, I swear, but my voice didn't seem to agree with me. It's in the flesh, it's in the blood, it's black magic. The power surged hard and, suddenly, everything burned out. The light bulbs in the lamps exploded in a hail of sparks. I could hear the fizzing and popping of cooling circuits and wires. The house was dark as sin and deathly quiet. Just then, the front door opened and my aunts and uncles returned with my mother in tow. My Aunt Lucinda looked around disapprovingly, illuminated by the moon through the open door, and asked, Now, were you kids playing black magic? I scrambled up off the floor and towards my mom, afraid that she would scream at me. Indeed, her siblings were watching her with apprehension. Her face had drained of color and she was looking at me in abject horror. Mom, are you okay? I asked. She looked at me with a terribly deep sorrow in her eyes before shaking her head and walking away. I got a call the next day about Kyle Gantry. He'd been found dead in his home, apparent heart attack, pretty surprising for someone as young and fit as he was. The strangest thing about it, though, was that all the lights in his house had burned out and the electrical units were completely shot. I've been racked with guilt ever since. I mean, sure, I didn't like him, but I didn't want him to die. I just thought it was part of the game. That's the most disturbing part now that I think about it. That it is just a game, to my family anyway. All of them except for my mother. And now, sitting here and typing this in the dark on my third bottle of beer as I try to wash the bitter taste of the memory out of my mouth, I think I know why. Just like I think I know what happened to my father. Black magic.
He was the sweetest child in the world. There was no doubt about that. The moment he was born, people gathered round the nursery, pointing at his sleeping form and crooning. What gorgeous hair, what beautiful lips, what adorable chubby cheeks. Fathers ignored their own newborn children in favour of that tiny, perfect baby. Mothers toddled to the glass and pressed tired faces against it, crying for their poor fortune. How much better life would be if that was their child. The nurse that delivered him was amazed when she first held him in her arms. His skin was creamy and white, not that mottled pink every other baby sported. At first, she thought he was dead, his eyes shut and his dark brown curls matted against his skull. As soon as she held him, however, she knew he was just fine. He opened his eyes and looked at her with all of the intelligence of an adult, breathing calmly and wrapping his tiny infant finger around a loose strand of her thin blonde hair. He never once cried, and his mother worried from her bed, sitting up and crying out that the nurse that so lovingly cradled her baby. "My baby, what's wrong with him?" Her voice was weak and her eyes fluttered as she exhaustively fumbled at the bedsheet she was swaddled in. The nurse glared at her over this perfect babe's head and snapped at the woman. There was nothing wrong with this child, and there never would be. Reluctantly, the nurse snipped the child's umbilical cord and set him gently in the nursery, lovingly kissing his head and promising that she would come back for him. Late that night, the nurse quietly tiptoed back into the mother's room, a hospital-issued pillow clutched calmly in her hands. She smothered the mother silently and cleanly, with no one the wiser. The child would be hers, no matter what she had to do for it. She would kill 1,000 women to get her hands on that lovely little boy. Swiftly, she crept back into the nursery, bending over the tiny crib that held her angel. Crooning, she told the baby boy stories of how she would love him as he grew, and how well taken care of he would be. The nurse didn't even hear the man sliding into the nursery behind her, a scalpel held firmly in his left hand. She didn't even feel the cold steel slide delicately around her slender throat. She didn't feel the two sides of her skin part cleanly when so gently coaxed by the clean blade. Nor did she feel the slick gush of blood out of her throat as she happily died, her fingertips gently caressing the perfect child's gorgeous face, even in the last throes of death. The man who had so proficiently murdered the nurse stepped over her dying body, a look of absolute adoration plastered on his face. Without a word, he picked the child up into his arms and stole out of the hospital. Behind him, every nurse and doctor in the maternity ward went insane looking for him. It was a serene summer's night outside, warm enough for the man to carry the child back to his apartment, leaving his car and his very pregnant wife back at the hospital he had so deftly escaped from. When he arrived back at his apartment, he did not sleep. Instead, he sat the tiny beautiful boy on his bed and watched him. For 14 days he watched the child, only moving to feed it and bathe it, and give it all of the care it needed and more. The babe was the centre of his universe. Soon, his wife came home, with a mouthful of angry words, to toss at her neglectful husband and a tiny babe of her own to care for. "You left me alone at a hospital to have a baby all on my own. Not a word from you. I thought you were dead, Adam." She threw her purse ferociously at her husband, who had yet to even look at her. The baby in the stroller she had been so lovingly attentive to before, opening the door, was left back at the entrance to the apartment. The child inside it woken by its mother's piercing shrieks. When the mother walked up to kick the man she so suddenly and violently despised, she laid eyes on the most perfect child she had ever seen. It was a tiny, glowing white child, with huge black eyes, and the most flawless dark curls on the face of the earth. Without hesitation, she leapt forward her weakened, starved husband, and choked the last bits of life out of him. Desperate to lay her lips against the child, watching as his face turned increasingly blue and frantic, the tighter she pulled her longing fingers around his neck. Moments later, she was on the bed, wrapped as tightly around the darling babe as she should be without harming it. She drank in its warmth, ignoring the increasingly distressed cries of her own child. Soon, irritated beyond belief by her own incredibly flawed child's cries for affection, she took her aggression out on it. Leaping up from the bed as quickly as she could, not wanting to be away from the vision of beauty sleeping serenely on her bed for too long, she picked her child up with one hand, slamming it fiercely against the wall of the apartment, until its head was a mashed mess of blood, bone, and brain bubbling out, dirtying her hands. The police came knocking on the apartment door not too much longer. Terrified by the vicious noise in the apartment beside them, the family next door had dialed 911, reporting domestic abuse. Cautiously, hands on the guns that rested at their hips, the two police entered the apartment. Upon entering, their noses were assaulted by several awful smells. Rot, death, and the smell of someone who had been sitting in their own filth for 2 weeks wafted through the air of the stuffy apartment. It didn't take long for the officers to see the destruction that had occurred in this place. The gaunt-dead husband dragged half-heartedly into the hallway, his hair matted with blood. The younger officer swayed on his feet, threatening to faint. "Listen, Tredu, sir. I have a pregnant wife at home. I can't do this. I can't get killed in here." His plea was quiet and despondent, but the elder officer simply waved the man forward. They could hear cooing in the bedroom down the hall, and stepping over the dead man that lay at the entrance, entered the open door to the room. Immediately upon entering, the elder officer bent down and vomited, the scene that met his eyes too much for even someone as experienced as him to handle. Blood was smeared on the wall, where a dead baby, lying there on the floor, its face a smashed mess, had been mercilessly beaten. On the bed was a chubby woman, obviously the woman who had borne and murdered the baby. Cradled in her arms, pressed firmly against the swollen breast, was a naked, rotten baby, its skin blue and its mouth puffed up with death. She was whispering to it sweetly, the most contented look on her face. The younger officer, however, was calm. It was clear what he must do. That woman held an angel, and he wanted it. Such a perfect child had never existed. The decision was easy to make. Pulling out his gun quickly, he shot the woman once in the head, delighting in the explosion of gorgeous crimson that fanned out behind her. The younger man's companion turned, a look of confusion on his face. Immediately, he was met with 2 bullets in the left eye. Smiling, the younger man watched his friend slide back against the already bloodied wall behind him. That baby would be his, and no one would stop him from taking it now.
Hey guys, If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. You can also leave a comment below. All feedback, good or otherwise, is always appreciated. If you have any creepy stories of your own, or have any topics that you would like me to cover, feel free to send them in via any of my social media. You can find all links to my social media in the description below. Until next time guys, make sure you lock your doors, stay safe, and I'll see you next video.